eventually just put a bylaw in that say if you live within this space of the water, you have to have a dike. The other factor we looked at, which I don't think is on there, is precipitation. Future projections state that there will be a decrease in snow and an increase in rain in the winters, and that there will overall be a wetter winter and spring but drier during the summer. So there's obviously impacts associated with that: increased pressures on sewers and culverts, potential for contamination of municipal water systems, the availability of hydropower, which we heard about, drought in the summer due to lack of rain, and then changes in agriculture due to irrigation issues, which in Delta was a big issue because agriculture is a huge industry there. You can see that it wasn't an easy task, and I was really happy that when we were in Delta, we had staff from all sorts of departments, because, you know, the lady who's in charge of biodiversity, she kept throwing out, you know, well, what about, you know, this frog, or what about this bird? And they have Burns Bog. I didn't think it's called Burns Bog in Delta, which is a huge bird flyway. And she kept raising all these issues about that, and then the engineer was saying, well, what about the dikes? And the guy who does the sandbagging was talking about the sandbagging the whole time. So it really fortified that it has to be interdisciplinary, and it has to have that whole team aspect to it. The next one I have is a sample worksheet from our third workshop, which was on choosing a priority planning area, which we identified in the preceding workshop, and then setting 3 preparedness goals. So the goals are meant to act as the framework, and then the actions are the specifics of what you're going to do. Now, I do have to caution, these were just sample actions that were part of the brainstorming exercise, so they don't take into account money, they don't take into account political will, and they don't take into account time. So you'll see there, so increasing capacity to manage stormwater, and then specific actions to how you're going to do that. So we just went through 3, and so we did that for each of those priority planning areas you saw before. So you can see why these things took all day, and by the end we were all sort of preparedness planned out. I'm going to go back 2 slides, which I have to figure out how to do. Sorry. Oh, there we go. Now, what did we hear from our municipalities? We received a lot of feedback about what worked, what didn't work, and what barriers existed. One of the resounding comments was that the terminology was often far too unclear. So, you know, what's an impact? What's an expected stress? What's a projected stress? Preparedness, vulnerability, risk. So for folks that aren't dealing with these issues all the time, they just looked at it and kind of went wide-eyed, deer in the headlights sort of thing. So Delta in particular felt that the process was good at triggering dialogue, but if it was too complicated, it could end up being quite alarmist and result in misinformation for the community, and they were really fearful of that. Partially, they don't want people moving out. You can't blame them. So it was one of the comments. The other one they pointed out, which I alluded to, is that there needed to be a time component, because you need to distinguish between goals that are short-term and cost-effective. You need those successes to say, we did this, it resulted in this, to then build off of, to build popularity for your longer-term, perhaps more costly options. One of the most interesting things that we found out, which we never anticipated, and that was what I alluded to in point 2, is that though the impacts might be similar, more rain here, more rain in Sudbury, that the impacts of that would be really different. And my favorite example is about fog. You know fog well here. St. John's is very, very foggy. Last year the airport was closed for 4 days. They had thousands of people stranded in St. John's. And so we were sort of like, well, okay, that's inconvenient. And Air Canada probably had to deal with the bulk of that inconvenience. But what we found out was that there's only enough food on the island for 7 days in their grocery stores. So if you have a food event and your ships aren't coming in, if you have a fog event, and your ships aren't coming in, you have a fog event and planes aren't coming in, and you've got food for 7 days, you're going to have a real health and safety issue once that food runs out. So we immediately asked them, well, what do you grow here? And the woman said, moose meat and berries. So you can see your options would be limited if you ran out of food. Here, of course, it's the dikes. We never realized all the uses for the dikes. We kind of thought, all right, well, protection, but people cycle on them, people run on them, you know, people recreate in general on them. So there's that issue as well. And for Sudbury, it was roads. Sudbury is the largest land-based municipality in Canada. It's larger than 3/4 of the GTA. Now their population is 130,000. So you can imagine there's roads connecting all these 130,000 people over a huge geographic area. It freezes, it thaws, it freezes, it thaws, it freezes, it thaws. They really do have the worst potholes in all of Canada. So these people are calling to say, fix this pothole, plow my streets. Well, they don't have the money to do it all because they've only got 130,000 people paying taxes. So for Sudbury, that's a huge problem. And with increases in freeze and thaw cycles, they're really going to have to deal with it that much more. The other thing we found out is that sometimes more is just more. It's not better. And that simplicity was key. So you really need to balance simplicity in the process of adaptation planning as well as accuracy in processing the scientific information and doing your risk assessments. Cases where the cities were just starting to look at adaptation planning, it couldn't be overwhelming and too complicated. Staff out in St. John's sort of looked at us like we were crazy when we came in with these worksheets. They thought, well, are you going to do them for us? They just didn't know where to even start. In the case of Delta, they were already doing so much on climate change preparedness or climate change in general, and they were starting to look at how to incorporate preparedness on that. They were perfectly, rolling up their sleeves, ready to work on going through the worksheets, going through the processes, the matrices. Oh, I'm jumping ahead again. There we go. So where do we go from here? What were our lessons learned through this whole project? So essentially we found out that preparing for climate change, it's not a one-size-fits-all process, and there's no one process that'll work for everyone, or in our case, every municipality. Beginning municipalities don't need those complex matrices, and advanced municipalities, well, maybe I should say beginning municipalities really just need some assistance in sitting down and having the conversation, starting to talk about climate change preparedness and how to integrate that. Whereas the more advanced municipalities, they're the ones who need the actual formulas on how to do it in this many years of your culverts and what's the frequency of the 1 in 500 now versus the 1 in 200 storm or the 1 in 100 storm. They're the ones who can operate on that. So this guidebook, it's not the solution for every municipality in Canada, and it can't possibly be. It's just a tool for some of them. What the guidebook can do is help determine other areas of vulnerability that you're not necessarily looking at. So the sea level rise, that's an obvious one to the dikes, but it'll help start triggering new conversations. So pine beetle came up. I mean, that's not a new conversation, but we started looking at all those other areas, West Nile. In the case of St. John's, an interesting one, given the polar bear slide that just happened, the planner in St. John's was telling us that they were finding polar bears in Labrador, which they've never had before. So pieces of ice are breaking off earlier than they would, and polar bears are floating down the coast of Labrador. And municipal staff in the communities in Labrador are having to deal with this. Because if it ends up on land, that's a huge safety risk for individuals there. So they now have to have a process of what do you do when there's a polar bear floating by Happy Valley Goose Bay earlier in the year? So another resounding message we had was that the planning needs to be interdisciplinary and interdepartmental. There's no one department that has all the answers. It really needs to be all departments looking at together. Planners must put on their engineering hats. Engineers need to look at things as sociologists, and mayors need to look at things as staff. It's not impossible. There was an event held in Toronto, I guess February of this year, and the head of Engineers Canada started talking about social cohesion and social welfare, and we were all looking at ourselves like, this is an engineer talking about social cohesion. So it can happen, and that's what needs to happen for it to really be a holistic process. And I would argue that building solid climate preparedness teams is the best way to do that. If you have a meeting where you have your CEO, your city manager, your head of fire, your head of police, they're all sitting together talking about climate adaptation, well, that's the way you're going to get approaches that go throughout the entire community. It brings me to my next point about political champions. It's one of the things the book talks about, and we thought, well, couldn't it just be a climate change champion? Couldn't it be Dr. McBean, somebody in the community talking about climate change adaptation? And we found out that though that's fantastic and needed, it really does have to be a political commitment if you're asking your municipality to do it, because you need to solidify that process. You need to solidify that direction so that all the municipal staff really are working along the same line. Delta and Sudbury both had a mayor that set the direction. They said, we want to look at climate change, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. Case of poor St. John's, their former mayor, they've luckily now had a re-election, was very much a climate change naysayer. He wrote articles in the local paper that David Ciuk was a quack job and So this is what they're dealing with. Hence, they had one woman looking at both mitigation, adaptation, and she was just doing it her pet project before she retired next year. So it really is about engaging that political level. And then community partnerships. So through dialogue, such as this one, working with residents to show that, okay, well, the municipality can do it. The municipality can fix the infrastructure. But you all need to also fix your own infrastructure, your own houses, your own windows, your own basements, disconnecting your downspout, all those things that will help. We gave all these recommendations to NRCan, which is now processing a report, and it should be available online in the next month, I think. And some of the things that are coming up are these new regional adaptation collaboratives. I think I have the acronym right. So 6 of these across the country, essentially to act as centers where stakeholders from those 6 regions can interact on climate adaptation: municipalities, universities, nonprofits, provincial governments. And then the other one we've done now is ICLEI and the Clean Air Partnership, based out of Toronto, wrote recommendations to FCM on how to integrate adaptation and mitigation into the PCP. So those 180-odd municipalities that are working through the 5 milestones of mitigation planning now will also tack on the 5 milestones of adaptation planning, which will be a huge start. Future looks bright. It's not a climate prediction, but there are cities doing a lot of work. What I'll end with is by saying that planning for climate change is a bit like peeling an onion. You got to keep peeling and not get discouraged by tears. Thank you.